Terraria classes are badly designed. Does that matter when playing the game for the first time? No. Does that matter when playing the game for the second time? Of course not. Does that matter when playing the game for the 5th or 10th time? Maybe. It depends on the player, I guess. This is me fighting a boss with an endgame build for the 4 vanilla classes, using some of the best gear suggested on the official wiki. I'm doing the exact same thing with all 4, which is placing my cursor on the boss and waiting. So why is it that players have such strong and defined opinions about their favorite class? The answer is vibes, because if there are little to no differences in gameplay, Terraria does a great job at making you feel like a powerful spellcaster when playing Mage, commanding a bunch of minions is really satisfying, and so on. Still, Terraria is the only RPG I've experienced where all classes end up playing so similar, which sadly also applies to fan-made classes developed by the community. And in this video, I want to see why that happened. Starting with the most straightforward class, Melee. Looking at all the main melee weapon subclasses, they all did strictly more damage when used in actual melee range, which is nice when that's literally the name of the damage type. True melee weapons, which are all the items you swing above your head, obviously have very little range. The same goes for spears, short swords, and to some extent yo-yos. Flares require the player to position properly, and will deal a lot less damage when far away from the enemy. Boomerangs deal more damage the closer you are to your target, because the less they travel, the faster they return and the faster you can use them again. And of course, the same goes for weapons that function like a boomerang. This includes all of the launched flails on the wiki, like the chain knife and the KO cannon, and the harpoon, which for some reason is a ranged weapon instead of melee. As much as players like to meme on them, even projectile swords like the Terra Blade or the Influx Weaver flow this role, where if you're close enough to the enemy, you'll deal more damage because you'll hit them with the actual blade of the sword. In fact, by looking at the 188 melee weapons, which as a side note is almost half of the weapons in the entire game, there are exactly 6 that do not deal more damage in close range. The Shadow Flame Knife, which is straight up a ranger weapon, the Flying Knife, which is weird, Daybreak, which is here to help with the Moonworld fight, and yes, unlike it, Solar Eruption deals a lot more damage when used close to an enemy. The Vampire Knives, although you can argue that their spread makes them deal less damage from a range. The Paladin's Hammer, which unlike other boomerangs has a fixed range unless you hit a tile. And the Faerun, which somehow gains damage by using it from further away because it spawns more bubbles. But then, why is it that this melee range becomes irrelevant for the last third of the game after you've beaten Plantera? Because the game was never made with melee combat in mind. And the more you progress, the more this becomes apparent, hinted by bosses like the Twins that are a pain to deal with using short-ranged weapons. Or the Wall of Flesh, which instead of becoming easier the more players you add on a server, is probably the only boss that has a chance of becoming impossible if you're only using melee damage. In games, melee characters or classes often have some form of advantage over ranged ones. Usually, it's more mobility or damage to compensate for the lesser amount of hit opportunities you get. In Terraria, melee gets more defense. And yes, it will make min-maxing defensive builds easier, and you might survive a couple more hits in a casual playthrough. But does that make up for other classes being designed to defeat a boss that's not even on their screen? I can think of 3 solutions to fix a melee playstyle not being viable. The first one is to add complex mechanics to the class, such as weapons that make the player dash, parry, or maybe charged attacks, so the player is working towards something while they're not in range of dealing damage. Which, if you're interested, let me know if it's something you'd like to see me code. But melee is also the class that's the most likely to attract players that are brand new to the game. And adding features that require precise timing or inputs might be overwhelming, or even straight up unplayable on mobile and consoles. The second option would be to rework all of the encounters to work properly for both melee and ranged players, which is clearly out of question, given how hard this will be to implement and how much it actually changes the game. Think games like Silksong, where bosses have defined arenas and patterns designed around melee combat. The last solution, which is by far the easiest to implement, is actually what Raylogic went with. If the game becomes more and more unsuitable for a melee playstyle as it progresses, then the melee class should become ranged, so the less experienced players have a chance of dealing with challenges. This is by far the least creative solution, and it's a shame that as a result, maybe half of the melee weapons end up very bad, or even useless in some cases. But it keeps the gameplay simplistic, for better and for worse. Next up we have Ranger, which is considered to be the least interesting class in the game. Due to the simplicity of its concept, it's understandable that it ended up the way it is. And there isn't a lot that the developers or we can do to make it more interesting. Or is there? Ranger has 4 distinct weapon subclasses that use its main mechanic, and a few special weapons. The most iconic one is guns. You can place your cursor somewhere on the screen, left click, and the weapon will fire at your cursor, sometimes with slight differences depending on the weapon being used. The most common one is bows. You place your cursor on the screen, left click, and the weapon will fire at your cursor, sometimes with slight differences depending on the weapon being used. Although to be fair, bows allow for some more unique or fantasy use styles like the storm bow, but never end up being too complex either. Something interesting about bows is how you've got a tax to pay if you want to be efficient with them. As you enter hard mode, you'll be able to find the magic quiver, which gives you a significant damage increase at the cost of an accessory slot. Other ranger subclasses do not get that, meaning that if you're playing them optimally, you get one more accessory slot free of charge. Or depending how you look at it, when playing with bows or repeaters, you gotta pay the quiver tax, which reduces your build options. Also, archery potions are a thing for some reason. Next up, we have launchers, which are available near the end of the game and somewhat underdeveloped. You place your cursor somewhere on the screen, left click and... I think you get it by now. There are surprisingly few rocket launchers in the game, actually less than there are rockets themselves. A couple of them can be used for world building, either destroying blocks or placing liquids, but that doesn't really have anything to do with ranger combat. I don't have much to say about rockets. Unlike the fourth ranger weapon type, darts. You place your cursor somewhere... Right, I'm sorry, I'll come back to them in a minute. Finally, Ranger has a variety of weapons that can be considered specialty items. They don't really have a theme. Some of them behave like other Ranger weapons, while others can have really distinct use styles. But because they're so scarce, and they're all disconnected from the thing that makes Ranger unique, I'm not gonna spend more time on them. You should have guessed what that thing is, and why I separated those 4 categories from the rest. So I'm gonna ask you a question. Are you satisfied with the ammunition system in the game? Do you feel like picking one ammunition over the other makes for meaningful choices in your playthrough? Choices that you're putting thought into? Because I don't. The main system that makes Ranger what it is, to the point of clearly being shown in your inventory at all times no matter what you play, is ammunition. And the only way the majority of players will interact with it is by picking the most damaging ammunition they can find, and not giving it more thought. There are exceptions. Chlorophyte bullets allow you to be fully aim-free and just damage things by existing, and as a new player, figuring out that you're expected to use Jester arrows against the Eater of Worlds is actually pretty cool. But the vast majority of ammunition changes nothing to how you play or approach the game. Again, I'm not saying they should make the class more complex. Having simpler playstyles is healthy for beginners and can be relaxing for experienced ones. The mini shark is my favorite weapon in the game for a reason, and massive endgame bosses would be even more of a headache if you actually had to focus on what you're doing to deal damage instead of just dodging and clicking. Darts are the only weapon type where all viable ammunition types in hard mode have a quirk to them. As a result, if you ever go out of your way to play with them, picking a specific ammunition becomes a lot more meaningful based on your personal preferences and the situation. And I strongly believe Ranger would be a lot better if these choices apply to every ammunition type instead of crystal bullets always being the correct choice. Once again, I have pretty defined ideas on how to rework Ranger, so let me know if it's something you'd like to see. Mage is interesting. It's the only class that doesn't exactly have subclasses. The wiki tries to split them in categories, but those are purely based on appearance and have no gameplay consistency. For instance, the big gun is labeled as a magic gun, while the bat scepter is a wand. And the flower of host and razorpine are both wands, despite having different use styles. And the closest we can find to a subclass of weapons for it are the copy-pasted gem staves, or some rare specific weapons like the magic missile, flame lash, and rainbow rod trio. I like mage a lot. I know some players that consider this lack of consistent subclasses for weapons to be a negative, but I personally do not. It's exciting to discover how each new weapon you obtain is used, which is something melee and ranger cannot achieve as well, since when obtaining a new gun, it's usually not hard to guess how it works. This being said, when given multiple options, the vast majority of players will always pick the path of least resistance. And more gimmicky weapons of the class are often considered bad or avoided in favor of more straightforward, easier to use options. And there's no blaming the player for that, but I think it's a shame that despite having the most potential for uniqueness, the best mage weapons are almost always those that play the exact same as any other class. Mana. Mana is this blue bar on the right of your screen. You get to look at it for the entire playthrough, whether you're playing the one class that revolves around it or one of the other 3. So surely it's a well-designed feature, right? I've played a lot of RPGs. In games where mana matters, it is used as a way of limiting the powerful effects of magic, often to allow spellcasters to stay on an even playing field with other classes. Terraria doesn't use mana because it would improve the gameplay or balance. Terraria uses mana because mages use mana in video games. But mana doesn't feel good in the game. Mage weapons don't exactly deal more damage than other classes, especially not in a way that would justify preventing the player from using them. And the game combat is about attacking all the time. There's no strategy involved in playing around your mana. You'll use weapons until you run out of it, wait for it to recover, then do it again. It basically feels like a weapon hit bar that forces you to wait for a while before you can keep firing. No one wants to stop attacking for no reason, especially in a game like this where it doesn't have any strategic impact. And instead of making it interesting, we got ways of outright ignoring the mechanic. Enemies drop mana stars all the time, which grant you a ton of mana back. You can face tank using the Celestial Cuffs. The mana regeneration potion gives you absurd mana regen to the point of being almost mandatory to play the class. And most importantly, the mana flower upgrades allow you to completely ignore the mechanic, at the cost of mana potions, which you can buy endlessly from town NPCs. Mana is something the player is repeatedly invited to ignore or cheese to get going, because that is significantly easier to do than dealing with its frustrating aspect and how it clashes with combat in the game. While not exactly related, the way you obtain mana isn't exactly good either. Gear can give you mana, which is completely fine. The arcane reforges you can get on accessories are absolutely useless when compared to other options like menacing or warding. Plus, investing into them will probably get you to the 400 mana cap anyways. And mana crystals, instead of being an upgrade that you look for as you progress, feel like a task that you have to complete within the first days of your playthrough just to get started with the class. They're not interesting or hard to obtain, you just have to wait. Because, again, I like Mage. It is my favorite of the 4 vanilla classes, because casting spells is fun. I just wish the mana system was better designed, because it would make the class significantly better. Summoner. Listen, I like the idea of a summoner as much as anyone else. I did my first playthrough of Core Keeper as a summoner, because having minions fight for you is fun, and there's just something about killing enemies while you're AFK that tickles anyone's brain in the right way. This is everything I can say about the class that would be positive. Let's start with progression. Compared to other classes, Summoner has a laughably low amount of weapons, and by far the worst progression out of any class in the game. If you want to get started with it, your 4 options are either to play Journey Mod or get lucky with the world generation to get a Finch Staff, die a bunch of times and wait for an Abigail's Flower to appear, or play another class until you can get a weapon for the one that you actually want to play. Which means that a hardcore player willing to do a Summoner playthrough has to reset their world and create another map if they didn't get lucky with their world generation. What a lovely introduction to the class. But hey, you can also wait for the guide to kill a few slimes and wait for that 1 in 10,000 drop chance item that would make a perfectly fine first weapon for the class. Do you want a whip? Well, you'll have to defeat 10% of the enemies in the game for the zoologist to spawn, or explore a biome that's designed to be way too hard for you at this point. Because remember, you're still trying to get your first weapon. And while I'm sure that you could get it, because if you're watching this video you probably have a lot of experience in the game, that is not the case for new players, which lack this hyper-specific knowledge that you and I have about Terraria. Once you actually get started with the class, the progression gaps for Summoner remain quite apparent. For instance, there isn't a single weapon, armor or accessory you can get from the evil biomes, both in pre-hard mode and in hard mode. And some bosses or events, like Golem and the Goblin Invasion, also don't drop anything for summoners. You can't even use the Eye of the Golem because minions cannot crit. Over a third of summoner weapons are sentries, which are a very unfinished subclass, often overlooked because they're hard to play around. Which isn't helped by the fact that 12 of the 17 sentries are from the same event, which is both optional and disliked by a good part of the player base, and 2 of them are post-Moonlord. This leaves exactly 3 sentries for the entire rest of the game. This being said, lack of content can be addressed by mods, and I'm sure future updates will add a good amount of summoner weapons. Well, I hope. So let's go over the other issues of the class. All summoner minions can be used once and forgotten about. While that is the entire point of the class, it means that everything in the game going forward has to be made with summoner in mind. From a player's perspective, it means that no matter which class you play, you'll never have an optimal build unless you're also weaving and min-maxing summoner stuff with it. Do you want to play Ranger? Well, you'll also have to get a Blade Staff, Bewitching Table, Summoning Potion, and a Sentry if you want to deal optimal damage. Even if you're going for a strictly Ranger build, the option is there, and does not require you to equip any additional items. You just have to do it, or you're missing on a significant amount of damage. Another issue is that if you, as a Terraria developer or a modder, wish to add a custom tool for one of your classes, you need to wonder how it will interact with Summoner, and if it's not going to be overpowered on the AFK class. A weapon allowing the player to block enemy attacks or dash easily will be fine for all the classes as long as they have to hold it. But because Summoner doesn't have to, it can get out of hand very easily if you're not careful. This being said, this issue is addressed by whips, which at least give summoners a weapon of their own to hold if they want to deal optimal damage. Whips. Whips feel good to use. They have that fresh coat of paint that makes most 1.4 Terraria weapons special. And they definitely did a good job at making summoners do something while fighting, pulling the popular opinion on the class a bit away from the infamous dodge class. Because you know, other classes never had to dodge. But that's about it. They have very wide damage arcs and don't exactly feel very interesting to use. Whip stacking was never intended by the developers, despite being considered a meta strategy by players who know the class. It's clunky, because swapping weapons in Terraria feels bad, especially when you have to do it between every single attack. If you like the Summoner gameplay in its current state, that's totally fine, and my opinion isn't worth more than yours in any way. But I'm having trouble appreciating a class that relies on hyper-precise positioning to maximize minion damage by exploiting their AI and swapping weapons twice per second to be mastered. Again, none of which being intended mechanics. Does that matter for casual players? Absolutely not. And it's something they will most likely not notice without guides in the first place. But I don't think this is good class design. You read the title, and you thought you got me. So, what if your favorite class is a modded one? I'm not gonna go over every pitfall that can make a class feel bad to play, because those are on the modders themselves to address. Things like an entire class doing the same action with very little feedback differences for the entire playthrough, even if the visuals can feel good. Or relying entirely on things like clunky mechanics or RNG, which can and will feel bad multiple times during a playthrough. This isn't about joke classes either, like the clicker or the lawnmower classes, because they're not trying to be serious or well thought out ideas in the first place. And it doesn't make them any less fun to play, as its proud but unfaithful father, I love the clicker class. But does that make it a well-designed class gameplay-wise? The issue with modded classes is how they mirror the structure of vanilla ones. Because the Terraria class is generally not considered viable if it doesn't auto-kill bosses by holding left click, it's really hard to design good classes that feel unique to play without being considered unviable or overly complicated. The Thorium Bard, for instance, reproduces the mistake of mana by forcing the player to stop attacking regularly, which is frustrating. And even though it doesn't make the mistake of addressing this artificial issue by adding something like inspiration potions, well, the issue remains there. There have been discussions to rework the class, for example by making inspiration a per weapon resource, therefore allowing the player to switch regularly and reinforcing the buffing gameplay of the class, but those are far from being implemented. Another well-known example is the Calamity Rogue, building off of the Vanilla Thrower. Thrower was added, then removed from the game for a reason. Its main gimmick was consumable weapons, which unlike ammunition for Ranger, actually do not bring any gameplay value. Because if you change ammunition as a thrower, you're changing the weapon you're using altogether. If anything, it removed value, by making weapons impossible to reforge. And with their behavior being very similar to ranged weapons, it's understandable that they just got absorbed by it. I was surprised to see Calamity doing just that for some weapons, while having other ones be individual non-consumable items, even with custom reforges. And this is exactly what I meant with modded classes mimicking vanilla mistakes for no reason, instead of trying to do better. I know it's not widely appreciated, but I think the stealth meter is a decent mechanic. It improves the player's first attack if they wait a bit before attacking, which both fits the RPG idea of a rogue dealing massive damage on their first attack, and most importantly, makes this wait time a reward for the player rather than a punishment for using the weapon. Mechanically speaking, the items are also very straightforward, which is fine given the nature of Calamity, where the difficulty comes from fighting bosses with complex attack patterns rather than playing a complex class. But as a result, Rogue feels fairly similar to vanilla classes. If you want a more in-depth analysis of the Thorium Bard, or details and gameplay of their upcoming Thrower rework, I go over those in my Thorium design video. Thanks a lot for watching. This was my first attempt at making an essay video, so if you watched until now, please let me know what you think of this format, and consider subscribing if you liked it. Thanks to my channel members. If you're interested in supporting the channel while getting something out of it, I added membership tiers where I will be creating weapons with you, showcase them in a video, and release them in a public mod. And please, only consider supporting me if you can reasonably afford it.